Oh, whatever's good
However
for you.
long ago. Okay, cool.
Yeah, whenever you feel
Yeah.
like leaving, we won't keep you here.
All right, I'm out. No, I'm just kidding.
Like, hi, Corey. Bye.
Right.
We already talked for like 30 minutes before we went live, so I might as well go now. Oh wait, we have to talk to people too. The next wall, the fourth wall.
Oh my goodness.
Well, welcome, Corey, and I have here with me the honest teacher today,
Hey. My different hat.
or Jack.
Or Jack, yeah. One of many hats. So, and yes, people are starting to come on in here. Hello, everybody. So we're going to be talking today with Corey about his work as pertains to schooling and unschooling, and the choices that people may have, may not have, and should have. So we're going to be talking about all those kinds of things. So without further ado, actually, we just want to get into it with you and talk a bit about your background history, and specifically, how is it that you came to be involved with these issues of education and schooling? Like, what led to that?
At first, I want to say I really like your background with the black and yellow and the mics, and it's making me feel pretty inferior right now because I just have a lot of whiteness, kind of white walls behind me. So I just want to, man, I need to invest in some of those like foam things, whatever you got behind you. So good stuff. But yeah, let's get into it really quickly. Quick history on me and how I've gotten into, this niche topic of school choice and why I think it's so important. I actually attended government schools all through the K-12 system for 13 years in San Antonio, Texas. But when I came to high school level, we actually had something called magnet schools in the school district that I was attending. And magnet schools are still government-run schools or district-run schools, but you're not residentially assigned to them. And so I was able to pick a lot between 4 or 5 different schools in my area. And I saw the big benefits of being able to go to the school that I chose to attend versus the one that I was residentially assigned to. The magnet school that I attended was actually physically on the campus or right next to the campus that I was residentially assigned to. So the difference was night and day. And I feel like that had a pretty big impact on my life trajectory, getting to go to a better institution where I got to avoid a lot of the problems in the school that I was residentially assigned to. And so I think more people should have that option to be able to choose their schools. And for the listeners, in most places in the United States, the status quo or the default in the K-12 education system is you live in a particular place and you are residentially assigned to a particular government-run school just based on where you live. And so that creates a lot of monopoly power in the K-12 education system because of that residential assignment and because of compulsory funding through property taxes. Just imagine if you were residentially assigned to a nearby government grocery store. That grocery store would not have a particularly strong incentive to meet your needs. And so similarly, I argue that the K-12 education system, when it comes to the traditional public schools or the government schools, whatever term you want to use, they do not have a strong incentive to cater to the needs of the customers because they get your money regardless, and because there's high transaction costs associated with exercising another option. Without school choice programs, if you want to go to a private school or send your child to a private school, you essentially have to pay twice. You have to pay once for the public school through the property tax system, and then you have to pay again out of pocket for private school tuition and fees. So that creates a ton of the problems in the K-12 public school system. But regardless, I saw a benefit of at least getting to get away from that residential assignment by being able to pick a magnet school in high school. And I will say just real quick for listeners, the way that I define school choice, because it can get really messy, right? There's magnet schools, there's charter schools, there's voucher programs, there's all these different forms of school choice. But the basic idea for people who are just now, kind of understanding what school choice is, it's funding the student instead of the institution. In the current system, the money goes to a particular residentially assigned government-run institution, regardless of whether you're satisfied with that institution and regardless of whether you even attend that institution. If you go to another location, like a private school, the money doesn't follow you to that private school. It stays in the government-run institution. because of that compulsory funding through the property tax system. And so I define school choice by any system that allows you to escape residential assignment and to allow the funding to follow the child to wherever they're getting an education. So that could be like when I was growing up, I chose a magnet school. That was an alternative choice to the traditional public school or the residentially assigned school. But that could also include things like charter schools. Charter schools are kind of like magnet schools in that they are defined as public schools on paper, but charter schools can be privately managed. I think of them as kind of like a quasi-private public school. Even though they're defined as a public school, they're privately managed, but they're heavily regulated by the government. And there's huge barriers to entry when it comes to charter schools. In a lot of places, the school district has to approve the charter school to be able to open, which is kind of similar to having McDonald's approve every single Burger King that opens up nearby, which doesn't make any sense. So there's huge barriers to entry with charter schools. And the funding is through taxpayer funding. So they're publicly funded. So they're kind of this quasi public-private kind of entity. Mm-hmm. And then you have the voucher idea where the money comes. So if you're residentially assigned to a particular school, if you don't like it, you can take a fraction of the dollars that would have went to your traditional public school, and you can take that to a private school to pay for private school tuition and fees. The best form of school choice, in my opinion, is an education savings account. It gets you more towards educational choice instead of school choice, because the money you can take the money and use it at a private school to pay for tuition and fees like a voucher, but it's not only limited to that, and that the money can come into a individual savings account for your child that can be used on government approved education expenditures, which could include the private school, but it could also be used to cover homeschool expenses. It could also be used to cover micro school and pandemic pod expenses. So it allows for more customization, and it allows for more choice than just the basic voucher idea. I know this is a long-winded response to your first question, but I want to move really quickly also into where I more so got kind of excited about school choice and learning more about it and advocating for it. Is that after I left high school, I did a bachelor's and master's in economics. And then that really opened my mind to the monopoly problems caused by the residential assignment and the compulsory property tax system. And then I also switched to doing a PhD in education policy after being advised from my advisor all through my bachelor's and master's, John Merrifield. He was a big school choice supporter and a fellow with the Friedman Foundation of Educational Choice, which is now called EdChoice. And he recommended that I go continue researching school choice under Patrick Wolf and Jay Green at the University of Arkansas, where I did my PhD and really started to specialize even more in school choice, where I started to look at the effects of the Milwaukee voucher program and how it reduced crime, or at least we had evidence to suggest that it reduced crime. And then starting looking at more of these non-academic outcomes of school choice, such as changing mental health, changing reports of safety and satisfaction. And so I really started getting interested in looking at non-test score outcomes of school choice programs. So that's the basic history. And then I really want to point out, because this is kind of the main argument that I put forth in favor of school choice, is one, like I already said, it's the basic idea of funding the student and not the institution, funding the student and not the system. It's similar to other programs like Pell Grants or food stamps or pre-K programs, in that the money goes to the family with food stamps, for example, and then the family can choose a Walmart or Whole Foods or Trader Joe's. It doesn't go to a residentially assigned government-run grocery store, regardless of your choice. And that doesn't mean that I support Pell Grants. It doesn't mean that I support food stamps or using compulsory taxpayer funded for these programs. But all I'm saying is that if the money is going to exist in the system, it should work more like those types of programs where the money goes to a person instead of an institution. And so it's interesting to kind of look at how a lot of people who oppose or who support Pell Grants and pre-K programs and food stamps and Medicare and Medicaid and Section 8 housing vouchers, people who tend to be on the left, they support those programs, but then they oppose funding the student directly when it comes to K through 12 education. And the only way that I can kind of see how this would ever make any sense is because when it comes to K through 12 education, the status quo has a special interest that is very interested in keeping the funding system the way that it is right now because they get your money regardless. But when it comes to pre-K and Pell and higher education, the norm is more so that people already have choice and that people can take their money to the institution that works best for them. And so that was a super long intro, but yeah, let's continue with whatever you guys want to talk about.
Good.
Well, that's
Good
a really good, that's a great summary. It gives a lot of people an understanding of some of the work that you've done with school choice. And I think that I've personally seen a growth of interest in that. I myself have in the past taught both high school, middle school. I taught at a charter school as well. And I definitely see that there are more people who are interested in alternative educational options, especially now more than ever, thanks to all the shutdowns. Lots of parents are starting to look into virtual options, virtual charters, and things like that, because they're just like the government schools are just absolutely ridiculous with all their different.
They're not opening.
Right. There's either not opening or they have the kids
They have like crazy
being 6 feet apart, wearing masks, like doing all kinds of insane things. That's just it's just pure child abuse is the way I put it. It already was.
It already
was, right?
Well, yeah, it was already bad enough as it is, right? But and school choice has always been a good idea in funding the students if the schools aren't serving them adequately. But it's becoming more and more obvious, right, to families that it's gotten so bad that people are pulling their kids out of the system. They're unenrolling in large numbers, which we can get into in a second. But then families are also saying, well, the schools aren't even opening and they're still getting my child's education dollars. If your Walmart doesn't open, do you still have to continue paying them a grocery bill each week? No, you don't. Of course, you can take your money elsewhere. If Walmart doesn't reopen, you should be able to take your child's education dollars elsewhere if your school doesn't reopen. And I think people are starting to understand that the funding system just doesn't make any sense when it comes to K through 12 education.
And also, it's showing just how inefficient these schools are set up and how corrupt they are in many ways, how wasteful they are in terms of how they're spending their money and how the teachers behave as compared to any other either professional or just person employed. There's a lot of entitlement, you could say, as to teachers and the relationship with saying that they're owed the kids and they're owed the money no matter what, as if they they need to be entitled to their job no matter what, that families shouldn't have a choice. And schools administrations are so bloated that to them, as you said, this is a very big threat because there's lots of people who have a vested interest in holding on to all the different bureaucratic positions in the school, even if they're, don't do that much for the kids at all. They're just like, no, we got to save the institution.
Yeah, I think it's a problem of incentives, right? There are a lot of good teachers in the system and there are some that are not so great, right? But I think it's that teachers right now are responding to the incentives that are put in front of them baked into the system, right? In the current system, they get your money regardless, right? Through the property tax system. And so when you're looking at it from a cost benefit decision making kind of framework, the incentive for the public schools is to remain closed, right? Because then they can minimize any transmission of the virus or any risk for their members and their employees, but then they don't really sacrifice much, if at all, of their job security or their salaries. And they can also reduce, requirements like having to commute to work and then also to provide the childcare services, which was always part of kind of the deal that has been understood with why we spend so much on public education in the US today is partially because people understand the benefit of childcare services. And hasn't been so much about, the educational service. And I think that's another thing that's kind of becoming more and more obvious, that it was kind of like the elephant in the room for a long time, that no one wanted to say that the public school system was about like the childcare services that were being provided. But I think now people are really just kind of understanding and admitting that, well, yeah, one of the main benefits of the school system is that, you can go to work and you can have your children go over there, even if they're not getting a particularly great educational service. So yeah, I think like the way that I put it is, we have the way that we've seen things going in the past couple of months is we've seen private businesses like private schools and private daycares fighting to reopen, but the public schools have been fighting to remain closed all too often. And it's the main difference is obvious. It's obvious to you guys. It's obvious to me, is that one of these sectors gets your money regardless of how well they serve their customers. Otherwise, if Walmart was able to keep your money regardless of whether they provided you with groceries each week and regardless of whether they reopened, they would have a pretty strong incentive to remain closed, because it's costly to provide high quality goods and services to people. So from a pure cost benefit decision making framework, the incentive is to remain closed if you get the same amount of benefits regardless of whether you provide services. But I do think the teachers' unions have overplayed their hands when it comes to the reopening debate, because they thought they were going to keep getting the same benefits, kind of like how I've been kind of talking about this. But I think families are figuring out that they do have some power if it gets so bad, there is some form of power that families have. Even if you're not allowed to take their money to another institution, they can unenroll their children from the public school system. And they're doing that. If you look at the latest Gallup survey on this, they asked families, what type of school is your child in, public, private, homeschool, and they defined homeschooling as formally unenrolling your children from the public school system. In 2019, this is a nationally representative survey, they found that 83% of children were in traditional public schools, which is about correct if you look at the National Center for Education Statistics data on this from the federal government. In 2020, they just released a survey from August showing that only about 76% of families will be in traditional public schools from their survey. And that implies about a 3.5 million student exodus from the public school system, which we spend, $15,000 per child per year in the traditional public school system, which, by the way, is a lot of money. 13 years, that's $200,000.
Oh no, did Corey cut out? Oh no. I think he was probably gonna say.
Let me take 160 in my back.
Okay.
My computer's weird in that if I don't move my mouse it does the timeout thing, and then it disconnects from the internet. But I said that we spend $200,000 in the
right.
Look, give me 80% of that. Give me 160. And I think a lot of people would take that deal. That'd be a win for families, a win for the school system. They could keep some of the money for all I care. And the taxpayers could get maybe 10% of it back. That would be a win-win-win, but it wouldn't be a win for the teachers unions, because even though they'd get to keep $10,000 of the 10% of the dollars for a child who's no longer there, they want to keep 100% of the dollars for children who are no longer in the system.
Interesting. I want to ask a question about when it comes to people who advocate for school choice, does it differ in terms of whether they want public schools to no longer get your tax money no matter what? Or is everyone pretty much aligned when it comes to advocating for school choice?
Yeah, people are pretty much aligned in that the way that they define school choice is letting people choose whatever, and wherever that money goes, and it's redirecting the dollars that are already existing in the current system.
So would that mean, like, for example, if it's most public schools are funded through property taxes, would it mean people don't have that much property taxes taken out anymore?
Yeah, so when it changed, so we're not really advocating for changing property taxes. I know there are tons of libertarians who rightly argue that, well, it would be even better if you just didn't take my money from me in the first place, right? Just but there are actually, let me correct myself. There are some forms of school choice programs that if you send your child to a private school, they call it tax credit, tax deduction. So you would have a deduction from your property taxes, that is one of the ways to kind of circumvent the regulations that could have come along with some of these programs, right? If you don't take the money from me in the first place, then I don't have to accept the money from the government, which could have strings attached. So libertarians do like that form of school choice, but it's not as politically tolerable, and so more people kind of argue for.
You mean politicians don't want their tax base cut?
Right. Or
most people are arguing just to keep the funding system the same and kind of reallocate it so that you could, and it's an easier argument to make, that you don't have to take that next step of arguing, let's change the funding system, and then let's, let people pay out of pocket for the private schools, because then you also have to argue against the other side, which will then accuse libertarians, whoever are arguing to not take the money from you in the first place. They'll say, oh, you're just trying to benefit rich people, for example. But if you argue from the standpoint of, okay, we're not even going to argue about the funding mechanism, let's just reallocate the dollars that exist, then you can argue that this is an equalizing policy too, and that it would allow less advantaged families to pay for private school tuition and fees and pandemic pods and whatever the other option is.
Right.
So yeah, I mean, those are two different kind of ways to argue for school choice.
Got it. Another question, when you said like public schools, they may want to keep 100% of the funding, but instead of 10%, does that mean school choice proponents still want public schools to be funded no matter what, just less? Like public schools would still be funded regardless of.
Yeah, they would still be funded if the family chooses that particular school. So I'm not sure if you guys saw my debate from the other day, but I mean, it is really beneficial to just from an argumentative standpoint to argue that you're not arguing against a particular system or type of school. You're just arguing for people to be able to make the choice. And that choice set should include the traditional public schools. Because a lot of the times the enemies of school choice will argue that proponents of school choice are anti-public school. And a lot of people who do support school choice are anti-public school. And especially when you get to, libertarians or, kind of voluntarists, they don't think the government should run schools. And I've said that many times before. I don't think that government should run schools. And if we did have taxpayer funding of schools, that we shouldn't do it for everyone like we do today, where we have like food stamps for everyone is essentially what we have with the K-12 education funding system. If anything, we should just target it to the least advantaged like we do with food stamps today. But that's kind of more of like an argument that, the mainstream isn't really talking about much right now. It's more so just keep the funding the same, right. Let people keep choosing the public school. And then if that's the case, you should, just be able to take your money there to the public school. But if not, the money would follow the child to the private school or pandemic pod option or in the home in the homeschool kind of setting. But it also gets a little more complicated than that too, because if you think about how schools are currently funded, they are partially funded based on how many students they have, but they're not completely funded based on how many students they have. So a lot of people don't really realize this because they think like, oh, if you have 100 students and then you lose one student, you lose 1% of your funding. It doesn't actually work that way because there's funding based on student enrollment, but then there's also like block grants and other type of funding mechanisms that aren't based on the number of students. So Georgetown University has a good resource on this that kind of points out by state, and I can put it in the comments really quickly, how much of the funding is based on students. In Texas, for example, they estimated that it's about 70% of the funding is based on students. So what that means is that if a public school loses a student to school choice competition, they do lose a lot of their money, but they actually get to keep a good portion of it. And so what that means on a per pupil basis, they actually financially benefit. So when people are arguing that school choice defunds public schools, it actually doesn't. If you think about on a per pupil basis, they actually end up better off. Just imagine if you left Walmart to start shopping at Whole Foods or Trader Joe's, if Walmart got to keep 20% or 30% of your food stamps each week or any other, just your grocery bill each week, they'd probably be very excited about that, right? Because they'd get some money for not even having to serve you with any goods or services. So when I'm faced with this argument in the school choice debate, I argue that the public schools should be happy they get to keep any money at all. I think that families should be able to take 100% of the funding to wherever they're getting an education. But the way that school funding systems are set up right now is the reality on the ground is that the public schools get to keep some of the money. And so they shouldn't be complaining about, oh, you're defunding the public school. And by the way, I got to point put it out there really quickly, is that school choice does not defund public schools. Public schools defund families. School choice just puts the money into the hands of families as opposed to institutions.
Right.
I mean, like allowing people to shop at Trader Joe's doesn't defund Safeway, because the money doesn't belong to Safeway. It doesn't belong to a particular institution.
It's like, where'd the money come from in the first place?
I mean, in reality, it
families and people who are being taxed. Yeah.
The families who are paying taxes. Yeah.
Right. So
still real.
One common criticism people try to make of this is, oh, you just want to bring back segregation with school choice. So how do you deal with those kind of comments and criticisms?
Public schools are already segregated. I don't know if you saw the debate from a couple of days ago, but my opponent, one of his main arguments is he was trying to argue that school choice is somehow has racist origins. And so he points to the history from the 1950s and argues that some people wanted to use vouchers to segregate their children. And while there are some people who certainly did that a long time ago, there were also people in the 1950s who were segregationists, who opposed private school vouchers because they knew and predicted, rightfully, that school choice would lead to racial integration because the public schools are already segregated. And so allowing more people to have choices would actually lead to racial integration. And we actually do have 8 to 9 studies on this today from the modern day voucher programs. And all but one of these studies finds that on net, allowing people to use private school vouchers actually leads to more racial integration because it allows students to escape already segregated traditional public schools. And a lot of people aren't convinced by evidence, but come on, this is all of the studies on the topic. There's only about 8 or 9. And all but one of them find racial integration effects. But then it was an interesting argument that he was pointing out because school choice didn't start in the 1950s. John Stuart Mill talked about private school vouchers in chapter 3 of On Liberty. Thomas Paine talked about school choice mechanisms in the 18th century in Rights of Man. Who else? We already had 3 private school voucher programs in the U.S. in places like Maine and Vermont in the 1800s before Milton Friedman was even born. So a lot of the people who try to say that school choice is rooted in racist origins, one, they somehow leave out the fact that segregationists opposed school choice in the 50s. Then they leave out the fact that school choice existed in the 1800s and that people made arguments for school choice regardless of, much before, the 1950s. And then it's a genetic fallacy, right? Like just because someone felt a certain type of way about a policy a long time ago doesn't mean that people still feel that way about the policy today. And during the debate, I asked him if he opposed the minimum wage based on its racist origins, and he would not respond to because I knew he supported the minimum wage. But
right.
I mean, I don't support the minimum wage, but I don't support it because of the economic effects of the minimum wage. I don't go and argue about the history. I'll argue about the real life consequences.
Right.
And then if I am going to make a historical argument, I'm going to get the history right instead of cherry picking some history that fits my narrative.
Right.
So yeah, the evidence isn't on their side and history isn't on their side with
right.
That. And then also it's voluntary schooling selections aren't the same thing as forced segregation. Right.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of people will look at charter schools and then they'll say, oh, look, a lot of minority students are choosing charter schools, and they would be correct about that. Minority students are more likely to be overly represented in charter schools than they are in the traditional public schools. And they'll look at that and they'll say, oh, this is segregation. No, it's not. That segregation is government forcing people to go into a particular location just because of the color of their skin. That is a horrible thing. And it's the main difference is that that's force rather than voluntary selections. No one would really say that a historically Black college is like forced segregation.
Mm-hmm.
They would be more likely to call that something like stratification.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think people should get the language right when they're talking about school choice and voluntary selections versus forced government kind of policies.
Yeah.
And for those who are not familiar with the history here, just to like fill it back in with how, there was segregation before, specifically through zoning laws, especially in the early 1900s. There were specific zones that were set by the FHA, the Federal Housing Administration, under FDR, where loans were given to keep Blacks in a separate zone in poor urban housing.
Ghettos.
Right. And they gave specialized loans to nicer suburban areas to whites. And so the zoning laws, of the early 20th century were actually meant to create segregation. And then the zoning, by, virtue of, that's where you go to school, that's how they were able to do segregation backhandedly back then, which is, very ironic when people try to say, school choice is about segregating. It's like, no, actually schools.
Look at the public schools.
Are literally built historically, like known fact, to segregate, like for the purpose of segregation, to ensure that the wealthier whites could all send their kids to their zone, and that the Black people who, couldn't get those same types of loans on racial grounds, or if they were, in a poorer area, that they had to have a separate housing, they had to be kept out. So
I think these zoning or these kind of redlining practices originated like the 1930s. I would recommend everybody go check out a book by someone named Tim DeRoche. He wrote something called A Fine Line, where he actually goes through different locations and kind of shows how, like, here's the current residential assignment of schools in certain areas, and here's the redlining practice in the same location, and shows how they're pretty much the same kind of lines on the map, which just goes to show that this kind of originated from discriminatory practices by the government a long time ago.
Right.
And another thing I like to point out is, well, what about the history of the compulsory education laws and the common schools in the United States? How they were, we have a lot of systems that were explicitly anti-Catholic. Right. We have the Blaine amendments in several U.S. state constitutions. And then you had, the Horace Mann, the father of public education, argued for the common school system because he wanted to make the Catholics more, quote unquote, Americans, and wanted to make the immigrants more, quote unquote, like Americans. So it was really about indoctrination from the start. Right. The explicit purpose of the public school system was to make the other groups more like the groups that they wanted the immigrants to act like.
Yeah.
Well, exactly that. I mean, and that was a huge history across the entire world, with different minority or Aboriginal groups being intentionally forced out of their homes and brought into boarding schools. That kind of history is not taught in the U.S. public schools. And I say that personally because I literally own a tutoring company and have seen, and helped students across the United States, and obviously been a teacher myself. My dad was a teacher for 30 years, and I've looked through dozens of curriculums. It is not taught in any way, shape, or form the history of the school system itself in terms of talking about what was done in a compulsory education and forcing natives out of their homes, taking kids, kidnapping them across the world, Canada, Australia, United States, in order to, systematically indoctrinate these people into, at the time, some people try to say Western values, but really I say it as statist values, to worship the power of the state.
Yeah, I mean, that's a pretty clear conflict of interest there, right? You have a government-run school system, and of course they're going to tell you that the government is great. But yeah, I mean, I would recommend everybody go check out John Taylor Gatto's work on this, and unfortunately he passed away pretty recently, but he's done great work on the history of the compulsory education laws. And I mean, the Prussian education system, the explicit purpose of that was to create obedient soldiers and to create obedient factory workers. And that's where we inherited our common school system in the United States.
Right.
So it shouldn't surprise us that we have a overly structured kind of school system in the U.S. today that doesn't seem to be really much about learning. It seems to be more about kind of listening to people tell you what to do.
Yeah, and regurgitating what authority figures tell you, and
I mean, and I was one of the most obedient children in the traditional public school system, man, and like, because I listened, right? Oh, if you get good grades, you're going to be able to go to college. If you go to college, you're going to be a successful person,
right?
And so I did everything I was told in the public school system. It's only years later that I see, like, whoa, like I fell for it, right? Like I was one of the the obedient students in the system. And, hopefully more people can start realizing that before, they put their children into the system.
Yeah. Oh, I had another question when you said school choice is not necessarily about defunding public schools outright. So that makes sense. Now, what happens if in a given area, just like for one public school, for example, nobody wants to go? Nobody, let's say there's school choice vouchers or something. Nobody sends their kids there. Would that school go away because there's no demand for that public school? Maybe people think there's too many pedo teachers or something, or they don't like the curriculum and how it's separated by age and whatever. Would that public school then go away, or would it continue to be funded no matter what?
Okay, I'm back.
Oh,
so okay. What I got from you was, school choice wasn't really about defunding public schools, and that was it. So I didn't get any of the question.
Oh, okay. So I said that, and then I said, so what would happen in if people had more school choice? Like, okay, you'd still be taxed, and your money would still be taken, and potentially you may be getting other people's tax money that you may not have paid into the system, whatever, like food stamps, for example. Now, what happens to the public schools where no one sends their kids to? Do they continue to exist, or would school choice actually allow bad schools or schools where no one wants to go to basically die or to have those resources?
Traditional public schools can close. So and that happens if you're much below your enrollment. But there are some places like if you can Google like nearly empty school Chicago or something. A writer at Chalkbeat, an education outlet, wrote about this. They had a school which ended up getting closed, but the year before they were down to an enrollment of like 5% of capacity or something ridiculously low like that, like nearly empty school. And it took them too long, I would argue, to close it, but it did eventually end up closing. But yeah, I mean, they do lose funding based on their enrollment counts, which could lead to insolvency at some point. It could be lagged. I mean, it might be a faster response in the private sector and with charter schools. But it would eventually lead to these schools closing. That's also why school finance is really important too. A lot of people don't want to talk about school finance because it seems kind of like a nerdy thing, but this is one of the reasons why we should argue to restructure the school finance systems to have 100% of the money based on enrollment. Because if you're in a place where, like only 50% of the funding is based on enrollment, you can lose a lot of the students and you'll be fine for a good while, right? Because you'll still get a lot of the money. So there are a lot of groups pushing to, I'm pushing for the school choice aspect, but there are a lot of other people pushing for, well, let's have more of the money follow the child, like higher percentage of the money follow the child. So it's kind of a whole different discussion. And there are other people working on that, but not so much kind of in the public eye, I don't think. I think it's more other think tanks are kind of working on that. And I think other people at Reason Foundation are working on that as well.
I see.
Now, you talked a lot about school choice in terms of choosing entire schools or institutions. But what do you think about school choice or educational choice down to the individual level in terms of being able to choose whether someone takes certain classes or whether they even take formalized classes at all in terms of how they learn? What do you think about decentralized school choice or educational choice down to the individual level?
Yeah, that's why I really prefer the education savings accounts, because like with the vouchers and charters, it's a particular school that you're using. But with the savings accounts, it's kind of like universal basic income with an E in it, UBEI instead of UBI, where you have to use it on approved education expenditures, which as a libertarian, I don't like that, you're being told that it has to be used for education, because then potentially the government could step in and say, well, in order for it to qualify as education, it has to be this curriculum and this. But with the education savings accounts programs that we have on the books today, none of them specify like you have to have this. But that doesn't mean that's not a risk that could happen later on. That risk is still there. But we have seen that the education savings accounts are fairly unregulated, where you can use them for non-schooling expenses that are, kind of loosely defined as educational materials. And one of the reasons why, the E is put in there, kind of UBEI, is that a lot of taxpayers will, if it was just a direct cash transfer, would say, the parents are going to spend the money on booze, which, I mean, that probably wouldn't be the case for many families. And even if people did waste the money, it probably would not exceed the amount of waste that we see in the public school system. So it'd still be a step in the right direction. But this is one of the safeguards that is in place for people to support the legislation. That's just a political reality that if there weren't these types of stipulations in the bill, it probably wouldn't get passed. So, I mean, that's just kind of the realities on the ground with these kinds of reforms. But yeah, I think the education savings accounts are the best way to kind of have the most freedom in education while being able to kind of move away from our current system. And I will say, I'm an anarcho-capitalist. I think that we shouldn't have the government. I think we should have private provision of law and order. I follow David Friedman's work on that, and I actually wrote a freaking article on police choice. So if anyone wants to go check that out, a lot of people will be like, "Oh, you say the public schools are a monopoly. Do you think that police are a monopoly too? Oh, and you call them government schools. Do you call them government police?" And then I'll give them a screenshot from my article on police choice.
Right.
Yeah, but and I think vouchers in police could lead to an incremental improvement as well, without even being in an anarchist society. Just like I think school vouchers are an incremental improvement towards reduction in government interference in the education system. But yeah, I just think with the reality of what we're dealing with today and this huge special interest at protecting the government-run school system, the best approach is to push for things like education savings accounts and to try to limit the regulations as much as possible while allowing for as much incremental reform away from the monopoly that we already have. Some people, I will say, there are some libertarians that will oppose school choice because they think it's like a statist policy because it could have regulations. But I think libertarians should get behind school choice because the status quo is that we already have a ton of government interference in education. And even if the vouchers or the ESAs, education savings accounts, are slightly regulated, it's still better than the extremely highly regulated government-run school system. And it's all voluntary, right? You don't have to accept the funding. If the benefits are not worth the cost of the regulations for your family, you can say, you know what, I'm not taking it. I'm going to homeschool away from the system altogether. But if you're in a situation where that the benefits do outweigh the cost, you should be able to accept the dollars and take it away from the government school system. And that is, for libertarians, a good thing in that I think libertarians would be happy about the fact that the money is going to a person rather than a government-run institution directly. Some people will argue that some libertarians will argue that school choice is kind of like and I did have a debate on this at New Hampshire Liberty Forum a couple of years ago with Ian Underwood, and he was arguing that school, like education savings accounts, were like Social Security and food stamps, and that it was increasing government control. But I argued no. Education savings accounts are the opposite because the default with food is that we don't have government grocery stores. We already have choice. So when you go towards funding food stamps, that's an increase in government taxpayer expenditures and potential regulations. Whereas with the school system, the default is that we have 83% of children in government-run schools today, and even if they go towards a private school that has some regulations, well, they're in a place that is less regulated than the government-run schools, and it could save taxpayer expenditures relative to the status quo because voucher programs and ESAs, in order for them to get passed, a lot of the times, or every voucher and ESA bill that I've seen is tied to the amount that's already spent in the public schools. So if your public school spends $20,000, perhaps the ESA amount is only around 16,000. So it creates a reduction in taxpayer or expenses or extortion, if you want to call it that, as a libertarian.
Right. And I think that's an important thing to look at. I think with these types of policies or ideas is it reducing the size, scope, and power over government to control the destinies of young children? And that's really, to me, like the most important underpinning is that there's so many young people who are being abused and shamed and told that they are going to be stupid or nothing if they don't follow the government's prescription for their lives, hour by hour, day by day, for 13-ish, depending where you go, years of their life. I mean, that is literal central planning of a young person's life. And then they come out confused about what it is that they actually are passionate about or what they want to do with their life, because they're so used to waiting on someone else to tell them what is a priority and what is not. And so to me, what I agree with you in that sense of not wanting to, have more control of other stuff. I definitely also, do agree that getting to that decentralization is an important goal. The idea of just having more freedom for young people in their choice of learning, whether that is a private school or, leading to hopefully eventually unschooling or self-directed education, just because, the whole process of children going through this one-size-fits-all policy, if it is repeated even in the school choice paradigm, that itself could still be very destructive for young people. But I do imagine that more than ever, especially with the shutdowns, and I've personally witnessed it because I work with young people right now who are on remote learning programs and their parents. There are more families than ever who are just realizing, because they're witnessing it firsthand, how much of a waste the school system is right now and how much young people are just sitting there and going through modules just to regurgitate useless information that you can Google search anytime.
They're not even interested in,
right?
That they're not going to apply, maybe forever, maybe for the rest of their lives. There's so many things I learned about chemistry, biology that I don't implement today as a programmer. I don't, and why? That was all those hours wasted.
But that mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell, don't you? A squared plus b squared equals c squared. Like a lot of people say like, oh, well, if you're an engineer, you'll use the a squared plus b squared equals c squared and whatnot. But yeah, you can learn it. You can learn it when you need it, right? Exactly. Just like we do with anything else in life. And I mean, I think, I don't know who said this quote first, but yeah, if we had compulsory education laws starting at 6 months, people would think that you wouldn't be able to learn how to walk without the government schools.
Right. Yeah.
Right? You go, oh, yeah, I know how to walk. And we sent our children to the government schools at 6 months. That must be how they learned it, because, they had to have someone kind of sitting there and instructing them to do so. But I think real learning and true learning comes from the individual. It comes from individual interest. And sure, you can put someone in a school system and kind of pour information into their head and have them regurgitate it on the test. And they could remember it for a little bit, but they'll probably forget it later on in life. And and yeah, I did really well in the public school system, but it was just to be truthful, it was just a lot of memorizing information. I was really good at memorizing information, right? And that's all it really was about. But yeah, if you just think about how you or I learn things today, we look it up on the internet, we watch YouTube videos, we read a book. If we really need help, we consult an expert or a friend.
Directed though. No one's telling you. No, you're not waiting for some authority to be like, all right, now, Corey, I need you to go learn this for your career. Like, no, you're just deciding of your own interests and accord. So
yeah, and I mean
your analogy with the walking. People think that now with schools and reading and writing, they think, well, without public schools, no one would want to learn to read and write. But actually, children naturally want to just know how to understand information or read a certain book.
I think the unschoolers have it right. Like Carrie McDonald in her book, Unschooled, I would recommend to everyone. I think she has it right, the idea of unschooling. I do support whatever choice each individual family wants to make when it comes to education savings accounts and picking private, public, whatever you want to pick. But at the same time, personally, I think unschooling is the best way forward, because I just think that's true education. People are really kind of like, what the heck is unschooling? What's everything that you learn when you're not in the public school system? And I mean, when I look back at my public school experience, the way that I remember learning things was not in the lecture format. It was when I would go home and read about the stuff on my own to prepare for class for the next day, so that I could pretend that I was a smarty pants and knew what the teacher was talking about. It didn't really click when the teacher was just trying to pour it down my head when I wasn't interested in the activity at the time.
Same. Yeah.
I mean, we don't do that in any other form of life, right? We don't say like, oh, right now you better be interested in math, and then we're going to ring a bell, and then 20 minutes later you got to be interested in English. And oh, by the way, you don't only have to be interested in English right now. You better be interested in this book that we're assigning to you. It's just so wrong. And I think there could be benefits of the system, especially if it's kind of tweaked and whatnot. But really, I think it's just people think that everywhere they've gotten, where they've gotten in their life would be worse if they didn't have the public school system. But they don't realize that, well, it could be better too. You don't know the counterfactual, right? If you would have had 13 years to actually learn things based on your interest and being guided by your parents instead of through the factory model school system, your life could have been a lot better. And it's really hard to tell, but
yeah, for sure.
But yeah, it just seems so unnatural the way that the system's set up now. And it really freaks me out a lot when I think about it. Like, I went through that for 13 years.
Yeah.
It's strange.
Here. Yeah.
And
as a coder, I think of those kids that you hear about where their parents were really involved and they're like, oh, you like to code, and some like 11-year-old, 12-year-old, and he knows how to program apps and games better than most college age 22-year-olds coming out of university with a computer science degree, an 11-year-old, because he was allowed to pursue his interests, and through that experience of coding and having that freedom, build whatever he wanted. I have that sort of corollary of like, gosh, myself, I wish I could have just dived deep as a younger kid versus be kind of
and
all over the place of topics that I don't care about.
Yeah, you're right. And I mean, we haven't even started to touch on a lot of the negative, unintended consequences or unintended or unintended consequences of the way that the public school system is structured today, with a lot of the bullying and the mental health issues, and just corralling, warehousing kids in these big institutions for 13 years of their life. They don't have very much autonomy. I would recommend people going and looking into Peter Gray's work on this. Where he thinks it's totally ridiculous that children are warehoused in these institutions for 13 years. They're not paid. They're not. Go ahead.
They're like prisoners, just told
you
where to go, how to think, literally.
I mean, I do like the prison analogy, but it's a little different in that when adults go to prison, they're actually found guilty of a crime. When children go to school, they're not found guilty of anything except for being the wrong age.
Right. Unless it's a victimless crime, then we can. It's not truly a crime, or
absolutely. I mean, it's very difficult for young people. I think, from what I've witnessed, being a former student myself, and then being on the inside as a teacher and also tutor. It's extraordinarily demoralizing for young people to have the majority of their formative years to be told that their interests and values are worth less, and that they need to turn off any other interest they have or emotional need or physical need in order to conform to the classroom on a daily basis, hour by hour. And if they do not regulate their emotions to be perfect, and I say perfect non-hyperbolically, perfect in terms of you better not disturb other students, you better be focused, or the teacher's going to yell at you, you're going to get detention, you're going to be shamed. It is an extraordinarily huge abuse cycle. And I think because the abuse is so grand, many adults live in fear, as you were noting before, about the comparative, oh, well, what if I didn't have this, what else do I have? Because they spent so many years being told, you better do this or you won't be successful. You're a F student, you're a B, you're a C student. You're not worthy of honors.
Conditioning you that your desire, your will actually lead you to destruction. And that's why you need to wait for some authority to tell you how to live your life.
Well, yeah, it's a big status quo bias. It's like, this is how it's always worked. This is how I went to school, so it must be how it has to work going forward. And I think that's the wrong way to approach it. And this kind of reminds me how a lot of people will make the argument that homeschoolers do not get the benefits of socialization, right? That's kind of one of the main claims against homeschooling. But they forget a lot of the negative socialization that happens in the public school system. The children learn how to be brats with a bunch of other children their age. They experience a lot of bullying, abuse, which could come from other students and the teachers as well.
Yep.
And
shame for being a nerd. If you get A+, well, you're a nerd.
Yeah, you're a nerd. Yeah, it's a bad thing to be successful, right? Yeah, so I mean, a lot of the people who talk about the socialization aspect of homeschooling versus traditional public schools miss the fact that, well, missing out on a lot of these forms of socialization is actually a good thing. And then homeschoolers can socialize in positive ways in other ways, right? They can participate in sports or do something. Yeah, they can. Yeah,
keep them home. They take them to the park where they can meet other kids. But the thing is, if the kid doesn't like another kid on the playground, they can walk away. They don't have to for the whole year with that bully kid who's going to shame them and make fun of their hair and their new shoes.
Have you guys heard? Have you guys heard this other argument against homeschooling? Is I think it's one of the worst arguments against homeschooling. Is people will say that well, the bullying teaches you how to be deal with bullying. It's essentially like saying that torture is good for you.
Yeah.
Right.
This spanking is good for you. This beating is good for you. You got to learn.
And they say the same thing about parents at home. They say, oh my gosh, that kid could be abused at home. They're not being monitored. And then they turn around. Right. I had a hairdresser say this to me and I called her out on it. She literally was like, yeah, these kids being at home with the shutdowns, they could be being abused by their by their parents. And then I'm like, well, what about the abuse in school? And she's like, well, they can't not be tough. They gotta learn how to deal.
It's all of a sudden a good thing now.
Yeah, that's so weird. Wow. So she helped.
I'm like, so it's okay to be abused if you're in school, but if you're at home, well, that's not good. Yeah. But at school, abuse all day. That's totally normal.
Right.
Abuse all day, every day.
It's absolutely ridiculous. And I mean, it's if that's true, then why don't you go start a service that charges families to pick on their children? No one has that service because it's not an actual benefit. Actually, like subjecting a child to this level of bullying is not a healthy thing for 13 years in a row for 7 hours a day. Maybe like every once in a while, but you can experience forms of bullying other ways. You don't have to like lock people into a school building for 7 hours a day with people who they really don't like. I mean, that's just unnatural and very harmful for children. And I think it's one of the worst arguments that I've heard against homeschooling. What do you guys think of? I'm turning into the interviewer now, but what do you guys think about compulsory education laws?
Oh, well, we're of course against all of them.
Horrible.
Yeah, of course.
I mean, it just means the state owns your children.
Right.
That you can't really help protect your kids, that you must forgo your own control of your own kids and doing your best to keep them safe to the state, some faceless bureaucrat or just some stranger. So yeah, of course it's horrible. It's like kidnapping your kids.
Yeah, I mean the way that I usually I don't really attack compulsory education laws much, but I'm mostly with you. And I think homeschooling, since we're allowed to homeschool, which is kind of weird that we are allowed to do a certain thing with permission from the government.
If you have to ask permission, then you're actually not free, by the way.
Yeah, exactly. And so it's kind of weird as I'm saying that, it sounds kind of weird, like, oh, we're allowed to do this with our family because But yeah, I mean, it's kind of a way around compulsory education laws. If homeschooling laws aren't regulated, that you can kind of get out of that compulsory education law system by homeschooling your children in a way. But another way I think about it,
states they regulate homeschooling,
a good portion, somewhere about half
you have to
2/3.
Have your kid take a test and show the state that you're learning whatever.
Right. A lot of the bigger states.
In New York City or in New York, right? I have one of the worst homeschooling laws in that you have to take the standardized test that the state, you can't choose your standardized test, it has to be the state standardized test, and you have to score at a certain level. Do the public school students have to score at a certain level? Are the public schools closed if they don't meet that proficiency level? No. So why are they picking on homeschool families and making them score at a certain level and then setting? We know what it's about. But the way I like to think about the compulsory education law, kind of argument is that we actually had compulsory church attendance in some U.S. colonies. I think Virginia is one of the colonies that had compulsory church attendance a long time ago. And they made the same kind of arguments, right? That, oh, well, it's for society. It's a public good. It's going to benefit the moral compass of individuals in society. And so since that benefits everybody so much, we can force everybody to do so. And a lot of people who don't think that religion is good and who don't think that compulsory church attendance would be a good thing argue for compulsory education laws.
Right.
And so if they're for one and not the other, they should have to explain why they're for one and not the other, because the arguments are pretty much the same.
Maybe they don't get it that public school is essentially going to the church of statism, you know, like maybe if they understood that.
Well, I think
in some ways it is kind of a religious kind of ceremony, right? When it,
flag for the flag, right?
I didn't realize that was a weird thing until 11th grade.
Wow.
Oh, wow.
It took me a long. So look, I'm telling you, like I listened to what I was supposed to do in the public school system, but at 11th grade, I started reading like Ralph Emerson and stuff, and I started becoming super libertarian. And I mean, we were all born free, right? We're all born libertarians, but I really started to realize these things as I kind of aged through the system. And then I started sitting through the Pledge of Allegiance in 11th grade, because it just seemed, and I think it's weird that like it starts in kindergarten, right? And in Texas, we had a Pledge of Allegiance to the U.S. flag and the Texas flag where I was growing up. And and you know, young students, like 5 years old, it's just kind of like you do it. You know, it's like the authority figures in the room, and you don't think about it. You just kind of you do it, and it like. When I realized it, I was just kind of like, "Oh man, this is so weird that we're kind of programmed this way at a very young age." And you know, at a certain age, you can kind of make these decisions, but 5, no, it's just kind of like expected of you, and like there's so much social pressure to do it in the school setting that you just kind of do it.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, just for me, I just say to anybody who hasn't really thought about that yet, I just say, well, how does it feel or look to you when you see someone do the same, but maybe it's North Korean flag or the Chinese CCP flag? When you see people pledging, you look at that very easily. You're like, oh my gosh, they're so brainwashed. They're worshiping this communist government or whatever, right? But then all of a sudden say, now take a look over here at the U.S. government and what they're doing to little kids. And now think about how that you readily see it in other places. It's, well, that's brainwashing, for their government, a different government. It's their government. But over here,
conservatives will say, "Oh, it's not brainwashing. It's not, it's not like praising the government. It's just patriotism. It's just loving your country and your fellow person." And it's kind of strange how the argument kind of shifts when you talk about a different country and this country. And I think people should have the right to do the Pledge of Allegiance and stuff with their own families and stuff, but I don't think it should be kind of expected in the compulsory government school system from that young of an age. I think it should be more of a voluntary thing.
I'd have less of an argument if it was, I pledge allegiance to liberty and justice for all.
Easier.
You actually learn what that means, like body, property rights.
Well, liberty means you stay at home and you don't talk about the government. And justice means whatever the government says. It's one party system. So there you go. But that's how it works, though, because you get young kids to believe in these kind of open-ended words where you can project anything that you have in your mind onto it. And that's the brilliance of the propaganda, is if you use the proper words that allow anybody to project whatever they have on it, right? Like hope, love, justice, right? These just big, words that could mean anything to anybody. You use that, and eventually what the government does is they associate their ideals with those words when they have their civics education and when they, basically have a kind of situational ethics that they teach children. So they teach children situational ethics based on this is right or wrong, based on what the government says is right or wrong in a certain situation.
And this is, go ahead.
Oh, yeah.
Go ahead. I was just going to bring it full circle and say this is one of the best arguments for school choice, that with the public school system, it's always going to be perceived as indoctrination by someone. Like even if you guys got the curriculum that worked best, that you thought was best. There is no one size fits all solution here. That some people would see it as too far left, too far right. Some people would see it as too much pro government. Some people would say that it's not enough government. I don't know, but
right.
no,
People
because
might
people
like Ron Paul or Tom Woods.
yeah. So because people have so much different beliefs about what should be in the system, you're always going to have this infighting about what the public school should or should not teach.
Right.
Yeah.
And it creates all these battles in the public school system that it's an unsolvable issue. Like it's always going to be this kind of back and forth between the left and the right and other parties trying to get what they want into the public school curriculum. And so that's an argument to just, okay, well, then don't force people into a one size fits none system and let people take their children's education dollars, if it's going to be in the system anyway, let them take it to wherever they want to send their children. And so then you can just kind of sort based on your personal beliefs and values.
Right. And because as it stands, it's a very small set of people who are involved at these school board meetings. And I often try to tell it to people to get them to really think about that, what you're saying in terms of who's controlling what ideas. And I say, could you imagine if they had a school board meeting and every person who was eligible either to send a kid or paid into the system showed up in this auditorium right now? What do you think would happen? Would there be enough to, hear everybody's views? It would be mathematically impossible to have everybody be able to get their 2 cents in of what they want to say, or even get what they think kids should learn, projecting their own inner idea of what they wish they could have learned if they were free to learn. So it's one of those things that when you actually get down to specifics and you get away from abstractions about the nature of public school and look at, okay, what are people really doing in there? How much time do they have? What are children learning? How are they being treated? It becomes very clear that it's just a system of abuse for the sake of keeping employment steady for a select number of people.
Yeah, I mean, look at Fairfax County Public Schools. They're currently not reopening their schools for learning. They are reopening some for daycare and charging families out of pocket in addition to the property taxes, which is a separate conversation. But they're also paying bus drivers to drive around town with empty school buses. The children aren't returning to school, but they got to sharpen their skills and drive around the buses around town. And it's kind of like digging holes of dirt and then filling them back up and paying people to do so. It seems more about the jobs and less about the needs of the individual students.
Yeah. And with your money though, like I could care less.
If you want to do that, fine. Yeah.
Right.
If it's your money, okay.
I shouldn't have to pay for you to drive around empty buses. I should have to pay for you to dig holes and fill them back up.
Right.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, this has been a great conversation. So thank you so much, Corey, for hanging with us and
I
being
had
willing
more.
to talk.
I guess I could keep going.
You could keep going.
Keep going. No, you have a burning last topic.
We've gone so well. I just, just want to be respectful.
Spend an hour, whatever.
Yeah.
Just let us know whenever you need to go.
Right.
But have you found then that it's easier to change someone's, like, do you have experience with people who were for public school and say it's needed to get them to advocate instead for school choice over, like, do you find that easier to convince some of that, like a statist, than totally getting rid of public school and having a free market in education? And not paying taxes.
It's much easier to make the incremental argument with people who support government intervention, because then you just have to argue for a incremental change of we're keeping the funding the same. We're still because then it'll get into the whole public good argument about how there's positive externalities. It's like, okay, well, if you buy that argument, okay, we'll just keep the funding the same but that doesn't mean the government needs to run the schools. And so that's an easier argument to make. The incremental argument's much easier to make than to say that you want to blow up the entire system and abolish public schools. And
because they see it as welfare.
Right. Save that for me. I'll do that. I'll do that for you. Don't worry.
Yeah, and that doesn't mean other people can make those arguments all day if they want to, right? People should be making different niche arguments to different segments of the population. This is how this stuff kind of works,
right?
And I've just found, for me, the most success that I've had is arguing for an incremental reform that, especially when the people who oppose getting government involvement out of education will say these things like, oh, you just want you're just anti-public school, or and people have like
anti-poor people. I don't know.
Yeah. Oh, you're anti-poor people, or you're anti all these other things, where in reality, I'm just arguing to keep the funding the same and just to reallocate that funding, which is a libertarian move at the same time, because it gets you away from government control, and it could put a downward pressure on property taxes by being tied to a percent of what would have been spent in the public schools.
Yeah, I see. And so then is another reason you advocate for school choice, because now we know cat's out of the bag, you're an ANCAP, but it's more when it comes to trying to influence policy, and those who have the ability to influence policy may be more amenable to writing some legislation for school choice, as opposed to, hey, I'm trying to get elected, let me advocate for abolishing public schools. Like,
yeah, I mean,
that's not
you
going
have
to
like
suicide at this time, even though I don't think that's a libertarian.
I mean, yeah, you have to. Yeah, the political reality is you got to get people to vote for the things for change to happen, and even in the courts, it's a political thing. Even if you rightly point out that the Department of Education is unconstitutional, the lawyers will tell you, "Yeah, I agree with you, but it's not. The justices aren't going to rule this way. It's just too big of a thing. Like it's just too like it's a political thing, and judges rule based on politics." All the time, you have judicial activism happening everywhere. But then I know there are people like Justin Amash who have written bills to abolish the Department of Education. No one else is going to vote for it.
No,
like people aren't. Even with the bills that are happening in Congress right now, with just even the bills to have incremental reforms, like take all of the existing funding, like Rand Paul's bill. Take all the existing federal funding, and then just instead of having it go straight to schools, let people decide where that money goes. And I'm supportive of that kind of incremental reform. But, even Rand Paul admitted that, it doesn't seem like it's likely to happen unless it gets tied to some type of like stimulus bill or something like that. And he doesn't even think that it's going to make it through the amendment process to get to that. That doesn't mean it's not going to happen. It could happen still. But that's what Rand Paul said on my podcast when I talked to him a few weeks ago. But it's much more difficult through the political process to get people to do things that cause big changes rather than small changes. Right.
That's why we love direct action as well. And, obviously anybody who is watching or thinking about their own kids in life, you don't have to wait for permission. Well, in some cases you do in different countries, but
depending how
you don't have to wait for permission to start.
Germany, you can homeschool.
Exactly. There's some bad places out there. But for a lot of people in the U.S., you still do have the opportunity, even though the government's take your money otherwise, to look at alternatives. And I mean, now is more than ever, it is a great time to get out. Like it is just a nightmare out there with what these schools are doing to kids, both in terms of what's happening in the day-to-day classroom, and now with the corona restrictions and things they're putting on kids. The things that I've seen are just absolutely heinous physical forms of child abuse that no child should ever be subjected to, like sitting alone, being alienated from friends, having your face covered all day unhealthily. It is just not good socially and physically and mentally. And the tragedy too is I've seen personally kids who are at home feeling super depressed because they can't see their friends. They can't go out and do the fun stuff they want to do. They're getting stuck inside because maybe it's raining a lot and they can't get exercise. It is just absolutely devastating to young people right now.
Or there's smoke on the West Coast.
Yeah, or it's all smoky.
You got to stay inside again.
Right.
Because there's smoke in the air because the government doesn't know how to fucking burn things.
Right.
Gosh. Anyway.
Yeah. I mean, there are other ways, right? You don't have to do it through policy. You can circumvent the government system by opting out, right? And people are doing that right now. They're doing that everywhere I've seen. Homeschool filings are just skyrocketing across the country. Like, for example, the most recent number I saw was from Texas. Homeschool filings from the same time last year increased by 288%.
Wow.
That doesn't mean homeschooling in general increased by 288%, but each year you file to the government, which is also weird that you have to like tell the government that you're doing this. But from August 2020 to 2019 to 2020, it increased by 288%. So that's a lot. You see places like Wisconsin overall, 128% increase in homeschool filing. So we're seeing this everywhere. Like people are escaping the public school system. Who knows how long it's going to be, but I think a lot of people are going to see this and say, whoa, like homeschooling is great. Like unschooling works. My children can still get social interaction in other ways. My children are happier now. They're less stressed out.
They get to spend time with you. Right.
Yeah. And while a lot of families are doing that right now, and I'm seeing like public school enrollments drop anywhere from like 3% to 10% in different locations that I've seen. Like, so they're dropping it like in a lot of different places. But if you're, it's a lot more difficult for less advantaged families to have the resources to kind of do this if they're relying on two incomes to get by, or if you're a single parent household that was relying and set their life, situation up around the school system providing free childcare, and that's not happening anymore. Right. That's a good argument to allow the money that already exists in the system to follow the family, to allow less advantaged families to opt out too.
What you just said there reminds me of two important things, which is that because there's been so many social services that have been coupled with the compulsory school paradigm, so many people associate schooling with childcare, getting food and things like that.
Right.
And it's really just demonstrated how perverse of an incentive that is, because by tying those things together, it's confusing people, making them not realize like, hey, regardless of your political spectrum out there, those things can be decoupled. It doesn't have to be school and, you need food. Right. You know what I mean? You can do food, you can do whatever else it is in terms of, needs, shelter, whatever, political arguments aside, without it being tied to the whole compulsory school day thing. And, for me, I'm just like, what do parents in these communities do when they're, I mean, obviously they figure out something. So there's got to be ways to still help out these kids. And I have seen that myself, just, working with the kids, I, get the messages from the districts, and they already were doing things like delivering lunches, either to homes or having a pickup period where they can go and get food for the week from a bank, or they can get lunches or even hot lunches at certain times. So that's already been happening with the shutdowns from earlier this year and going onward is kind of re-envisioning what could be done without having to be, and you also have to be in the physical classroom 7 hours, 8 hours, whatever a day.
Yeah, and it kind of seems like the school system is kind of taking some of the responsibility of parenting away from the parents, and the parents are kind of like using that as a crutch. Whereas if you didn't have that, they want to structure their whole lives around, the government school system, providing all these services. And if the money wasn't taken from people in the first place through the property tax system, less advantaged families would have more money in their pockets to be able to afford alternative services. Property taxes go down, rent goes down too, right? Because the price of rent includes things like property taxes that have to be factored into account.
Yeah,
right.
Definitely. Yeah. It's kind of like when you were mentioning incrementalism, it's like throwing it back in the status face. Like that's how some status have gotten more and more state power over time. They do it in increments. Like, okay, let's ban a little bit of this, and eventually you have, I don't know, no guns or something. But I'm just saying it's like trying to get people to slowly get used to more and more freedom on the same end too. So
unfortunately, I think a lot of the state power comes in times of emergency. I mean, I think Chris, why am I forgetting his name? Chris, economist at George Mason University, Chris Coyne, Coyne, he has written about how governments ratchet up power a lot in times of emergency because they say, we need it for safety. We need the government to do this, that, and then it never reverts back to the government influence kind of amount to the emergency situation levels. So it ratchets up. It might go down a little bit after the kind of issue, and then it ratchets up again, and then it goes down, but it kind of ratchets up upward over time. And it's kind of like a power grab, I guess you can say.
Yeah, like they did for in the name of Corona. Do you think it stays because people just get used to it? So they settle in, they don't really feel the need to
once you give
against it.
Once you give the government the power to do something, it's hard to get that back, right? It's just it's ingrained into a pretty complex system. And I mean, you see it with the school system. once you pour more money into the school system, it's always, you can't cut education spending, right? It always has to go up.
Yeah.
And if it doesn't go up by 50%, a 20% increase is a cut. And
Right.
so, yeah, I mean, special interests coalesce around those new agencies that the government creates, and the government program stays, right? That's how governments work. And I think it's,
They don't.
I mean, it also, yeah, they don't. Yeah, it's just that's another one of the problems is kind of like this whole myth of the rational voter thing that Brian Kaplan has written about.
Mm-hmm.
Mhm.
Oh
no,
just
Corey,
pause.
you
He'll be
cut
back
out
in a
again.
second.
But when Corey
He'll
comes
talk
back,
about
he'll
Brian,
talk about
Brian Kaplan, who.
yes, the myth of the.
That we have. Can you hear me? Of course, I didn't.
I
can you hear
know.
me?
Yeah, we got you. You're
It
back.
cut
you're
off
back.
right when you brought up the book, the myth of the
I
informed.
know. I heard you guys the whole time. I was like, I saw my thing spinning. I'm like, of course, I didn't move my mouse. I need to fix that on my computer. Just so it goes to show we're having such a great time. We're talking so much that it's causing my computer to time out. But yeah, I mean, a lot of this is we have other things to do, right? We have to go to work. We have interests and hobbies that we have, and it's kind of like a concentrated interest and dispersed costs kind of issue that the people that benefit from the government program that's created fight really hard to keep it. And then you and I, if we're doing other things, most people aren't hardcore libertarians, right? I don't know how many people are hardcore libertarians, but I would say most people aren't.
At least
At least 10.
We do the things that we do because we know that there's a coordination problem, that we have to get a whole bunch of people on our side to be able to get things to change. So we don't even take any action at all, because we know that if it's just one person doing something to eliminate, like the Department of Education, for example, it's probably not going to happen. So instead of allocating all my time to doing that as an individual, I go and I hang out with my friends. I go to the movies. I do other things, right? And so
become accustomed to it. They just adjust.
Yeah.
Adjust to whatever the status quo or authority is. Like the TSA, we're all used to getting groped now. It's just common.
Not me. I'm not used to it.
You're not used
Man,
to it.
and I started getting.
Not we, but a lot of people are just fine with having all your stuff looked at, and even having your stuff thrown away.
Well, yeah, because people know, like, even if I throw a fit at the airport, they're probably going to make my life a nuisance even more so. And if I whine about it online 24/7, one, I'm just going to like get my stress levels up. I'm going to get my, blood pressure up, and that's going to be bad for my health. And people are going to look at me like I'm crazy in the airport, and they'll think like, oh, what do you have to hide? Why are you freaking out about TSA? And so it just becomes like a nuisance, and like it becomes less stressful for most people, not like hardcore libertarians, but for most people, they see it as it's just not worth it to go. People just want to be happy, and they don't want to like think about it.
They try to avoid conflict as much as possible. Most people.
I started getting extra random screenings from TSA pretty over the last year, and I think it's because of my beard. But it's random. It's random, but they admit it's not actually random.
We gotta touch this man.
Oh wow!
They're like, oh god.
Well, he is an honest teacher.
I gotta be.
He had to be honest. Oh my gosh. Well, what does that mean?
They heard you're the bomb.
They think because you have a beard, so like what? Like they stare.
It must be associated with a certain religion, and maybe they're discriminating in that way. I don't know, or
possibly.
you're. I don't know.
Maybe they go to a public school there. Like,
maybe they went to a public school, so they're discriminatory.
Like, get this guy.
Right. They know.
But like I started looking up, like, is it actually random? And people are saying it's not actually random. They have like a system where they admit on the TSA website that it's not actually random, that they have like an algorithm. And so of course, like they're going to use observable characteristics of different people to put into that algorithm. And so like, what are they going to look at? They're going to look at, are you a male or female? Are you going to look at, are you, what race are you? What facial features do you have? What else are they going to look at? I mean, maybe it's like, is your bag this size? But they don't really say what they put into the system. So I don't think many
Are you
people
carrying a
really
paper
know.
on school choice with you? That's definitely
Yeah. Did you say something online that was critical of the government?
Right.
I don't know. So just to be clear, I don't know what they put into these algorithms, but they have to put something that's observable into the algorithm if they have one.
Right. Yeah.
And so by definition, it must be discriminatory in some way, but maybe it's not based on what the person looks like and does, but maybe it's something as simple as you have a bigger bag than most people. Maybe your bag looks, I don't know. It could be any number of things. And I'm not, just to be clear, I'm not an expert on airport security and what the TSA does, but this is something that has interested me pretty recently from getting more and more random checks.
Wow.
Oh, I'll have to send you my doctoral paper because that was my thesis, was on abolishing the TSA. So,
and the alternative was having private security kind of, or no security at all. What was your kind of thesis?
My idea is that terrorism, in terms of how they were approaching it, should be treated like any other criminal justice issue. It shouldn't be given any type of special categories of treatment. That the idea that the TSA has any type of authority to do that kind of thing is just absurd. That they don't really stop anything materially in terms of the comparative of what other ways are there to stop terrorists from blowing up stuff. And it's there's plenty of pre-existing.
Well, and do they stop people from doing it? Right. It still happens. And wasn't there a study showing like 95% of the fake materials they put through the system they didn't catch? 95% of the
there's a lot of stuff that I could go through with this. But
this might be another hour-long conversation.
Right. Yeah. Basically. There's lots of things that came through their systems, and there was ways that people could have brought stuff through. So it's more just the security theater aspect of it. Let's just, be a deterrent for really stupid people who are oh, okay, I won't go through there because I'm kind of scared, but they're not seriously trying to do something. But anyone who was actually serious, and actually was I'm going to really make it through, could basically make it through, because they missed so many things in their screening tests where they tested the system of, okay, let's have someone try to actually bring stuff through, and they failed. As you said, it was up there beyond 90% of the time. So
yeah, and I mean, you could even imagine safety being even better and more effective, safety protocols being more effective if you had private security agencies hired by the individual airlines to do these things. I mean, you might not get the benefits of maybe you'll have two different security lines instead of one, which is the TSA. It's hard. It's kind of hard to imagine what it would look like. But I think most libertarians kind of have a thought of it being kind of outsourced to a private sector, and then you can kind of choose your airlines based on how well they do with these reductions in unsafe activities.
Yeah. I mean, airlines would respond if they had an incident. Oh God, how'd that guy get on with blah blah blah? We need to whatever. They figure it out. But I mean, I have recent memory of not recent, but when I was a kid, I remember before the TSA was created, just going through regular airport security. They just check your bags. They didn't go through everything, but they had their own security, and there wasn't violence.
Metal detectors.
Metal detectors. And even today, on the cruise lines, you don't have,
it's not TSA, right? Yeah, it's some other mechanism. Yeah.
Sometimes be there.
Oh, I see. Mostly still just it felt more like the last cruise I went on, the old airports, just metal detection and
right.
Do you have guns on you? No. Yeah. Okay. Well then
they have things in other countries, what I mean? They have air marshals, or in Israel, they have specific targeting, where they actually look for people on an individual basis by looking at all the high risk security issues and stuff like that. They're just basically obviously the market ways would be unlimited of all different possibilities, but there are a ton of ways to have security without having every single person be rummaged through, roughed up,
Stand in
have
line,
all their
pick up
stuff,
your
you know,
shoes.
be
Well,
naked.
and it costs a lot of money because there's
Yeah.
no competition, right? So they always have the incentives to lobby to the taxpayers to just pay more and more and more, right? So that's just how governments work or don't work, as you would say. But with competition, you'd get better outcomes for lower costs, in theory.
Yeah.
Well,
Cool.
this has been a great discussion. I'm glad we got to talk about all kinds of things, you know, from airplanes to school choice to
We were even talking about intellectual property before this started for the listeners. So you can get kind of a sneak peek as to what we were talking about beforehand. But
gosh, yeah, we could do an intellectual property discourse if you want.
No, I have another kind of appearance that I'm got to prep for. If anyone wants to check me out on Newsmax later, but
right. Good.
Cool.
Well, thank you.
It was great being on this for I was only expecting like 30 minutes, but we were having such a great time that why not stay longer? So yeah, thanks for having me, you guys.
Where should people follow you and your work? Where's like the hottest place to see what you're doing? So
is that your?
It's just Twitter. I share all my stuff on Twitter. It's at DeAngelis Corey, just my last name and my first name. I'll share like my quick arguments for school choice. It's mostly education stuff, but then also I share my longer form articles on Twitter as well. And if you want to just find my longer form articles, if you just Google Corey Reason Foundation, or if you Google Corey Cato Institute, I'm the only Corey at either institution, and you'll find my work there as well.
Perfect. Awesome. Yeah, we just shared that to everybody so they can follow you on Twitter. Hopefully,
I follow you on Twitter.
Get at least 5 new followers. Maybe 100, maybe 1,000. I don't know. Who knows?
Yeah, hopefully I can catch at the amount of followers on Facebook. Facebook is where I'm slacking, but
we'll bump it up. We'll get those rookie numbers up.
Hopefully, they don't take me off anytime soon with their new
terms.
We'll see. We'll see.
All right. Well, thank you, Corey. And keep up the great work. And we're looking forward to seeing more of the good things you do in the articles and arguments you make. So,
thanks,
everyone. All right. Thank you guys so much.